My baby dolls, we are back. Another episode of Genesis is coming up for you. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we are talking Dodger Stadium. And what I mean by that is we got Jerald Podair on the show, and we are going to talk about his fantastic book, City of Dreams, Dodger Stadium, and the Birth of Modern Los Angeles. As many of you folks know, I had a show on the building of Fenway Park a few weeks ago. Last month I had Robert F. Garrett on the San Francisco Giants. Now Stoner moved his ball club to San Francisco from the Polo Grounds, and we touched on Walter OMalley a little bit, but I didn't even realize how complicated this stuff got. And we're going to talk about the whole Chavez Ravine politics, how it ended up in the courts, how, Walter OMalley was still not convinced he's going to stay in Los Angeles even after it moved. We're going to talk about the residents of Chavez Ravine, and we're going to just have a great time with this show because I love the whole political and historical and legal battles that went into doing this, and it just gives you more of an appreciation of what somebody has to go through to build a stadium in any major metropolitan area. But before we get to the book, before we get to Jerald, you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. And, of course, the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, is our producer, and I do a few shows with Ralph. I do Giants baseball, and that's a Z in there for the Zigzag Man, and we focus on past, present, and future of the San Francisco Giants, including the New York Giants, which were at the Polo Grounds for about 60 years. We also do a show on Oakland together, and we go back to Kansas City, Philadelphia, and we talk about athletics, baseball. I'm usually a stand-in there. And you can also find me on the Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia show with Sabre historian Al Blumpkin. And, of course, the renowned author himself, Dave Nemec. And, I always say I'm honored to be with these guys. These guys are much older than me, well into their 70s. And for them to invite me on their show and say, hey, you know what, you can talk about things with us. To me, it's an honor because, again, I read all their books, if not even more articles that they wrote when I was just like a kid into being a teenager. And then 30, 40 years later, you find yourself being on a radio show with them. So you never know when that's going to bring you, folks. But we do have City of Dreams, and I really like the book. Before I even bring Jerald out, I recommend anyone who is a Los Angeles Dodger fan or a baseball fan or anyone interested in understanding what it takes to get a ballpark, because it has so many different components, which we'll find out by Jerald. And, again, one of the reasons why Jerald wrote The City of Dreams, he wanted to provide a window into the complex choices cities face as they seek to balance the values of entertainment and culture against those of fiscal responsibility of private gain against public good. We'll go into that meeting, but that is what I want you folks to think about. Private gain in the sense that, yes, Walter OMalley was a business person, an entrepreneur. He wanted to make money with the Dodgers. Now we have the public good. Well, what are they going to be getting out of it? What are the citizens of Chavez Ravine going to get out of it? What is the city? What's with the taxes? And, of course, we're going to hit the left and right politics that came with it. Going to be an exciting show. And Jerald Podair, he is a professor of history and the Robert S. French Professor of American Studies at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. Of all the weird places, New Yorker, Los Angeles, he ends up in the center of the country. He is the author of The Strike That Changed New York and Bayard Rustin, American Dreamer. He is a recipient of the Allen Evans Prize, awarded by the Society of American Historians for literary, that's a real good way I pronounced it, literary distinction in the writing of history. And, of course, history and law are my two favorite subjects, and this book gave me a flavor of both. And without any ado, welcome to the show, Jerald. How are you today, sir?
Very good. It's great to be on the show.
Oh, it's great to have you. I don't know how many interviews you did before the show, but when I get into my cross-examination, it's just not the standard questions. It's more of a thought. Because number one, I don't want to give away the book because people got to buy it. And number two, I want to see your research, and I want to see what you're thinking and why this particular event or events happened. And what I'm going to start you out with is Walter O'Malley's decision to leave Ebbets Field. When did that happen, and what was he looking for when he was back in Brooklyn, New York?
Well, Walter O'Malley came to the Dodgers in the mid-1940s. First, he was doing legal work for them, and then he bought a share of the team along with Branch Rickey and another co-owner. So he owned the equivalent of about a quarter of the Dodgers in the late 1940s. He later became the controlling owner, but from the moment he bought the Dodgers, he understood that Ebbets Field was a limited place and that its days were limited. It was small. It had very, very, very poor parking facilities. The access was not good. It was not near a major highway. It had not been well maintained in the 20s and 30s and early 1940s. So his goal almost immediately was to get a new stadium in Brooklyn. And it's interesting that his co-owner at the time, Branch Rickey, who obviously is well known for bringing Jackie Robinson to the major leagues, was not as urgent an issue with Branch Rickey as it was with Walter O'Malley, and that was, I think, one of the ways that they split. One of the reasons that they disagreed. So what Walter O'Malley wanted from the late 40s on, and what he stated publicly that he wanted, was to build a privately owned new Dodger stadium somewhere in Brooklyn. But he quickly zeroed in on a specific part of Brooklyn, what's called Atlantic Flatbush, the intersection of Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues in the vicinity of downtown Brooklyn, just south of, I think, what we would call downtown Brooklyn. That's the site that he wanted. That's where he wanted to build the new stadium. The problem for him is that, we have a tendency to think of owners of baseball teams as always independently wealthy with unlimited amounts of funds. Walter O'Malley was a wealthy man, but he was not one of, let's say, the richest 10 or 15 men in New York. And he couldn't finance the entire stadium deal in Brooklyn, meaning the land and the ballpark, by himself. He would be able to build the stadium himself. He would go into debt for that, but he could do it. But he needed the land. And that became the great sticking point in Brooklyn, how to get land, or the land that he wanted, at Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues at some sort of reasonable price. And if you want to, in a nutshell, if you want to know why the Dodgers left Brooklyn, it was because of the land at Atlantic and Flatbush that they couldn't acquire it.
Now, we're going to go into that in a second. Now, let me ask you this for a thought-provoking question. Shibe Park, or Connie Mack Stadium, because Connie Mack retired in 1950 after about 60-something years with the Philadelphia Athletics, that also was in disrepair. My question to you is this. O'Malley had the money. If he couldn't get the land at Atlantic and Flatbush, because all the trains run there. I mean, whenever I take the train,
Right. There are 9 subway lines that come together there. I actually counted.
Yeah, and you got the IRT, you got the Long Island Railroad, and you got the DBC.
God, yeah, you got all the numbers, and the 9 I counted were in addition to the Long Island Railroad. So that would have been perfect for him because you have all the Dodger fans who were moving out to Long Island in the 1950s. Well, they can take the Long Island Railroad and get right to the stadium.
Right, and the thing is this now. I think Barclays Center is a little way up from it, but that is...
It's actually very close to it. It's not necessarily across the street, but almost on the same property that O'Malley wanted, yeah.
Right, and that just opened about 5 years ago. And I've not there. It figures, I moved out of Brooklyn 24 years ago.
And they built a spiffy new arena, yeah.
Yeah, and now you got my Islanders playing there, and you got the Nets moved from Jersey, and you got the Cyclones, which are for the Mets thing. But why didn't O'Malley, even with even with the transportation and the area of Ebbets Field not as great as it could be, why didn't he just reinvest in a makeover of the stadium, bring the walls in to be a little bit more modern, and just get buses, which are right now, if you ever pass the Ebbets Field, it's right by Prospect Park. It's a very congested area.
Well, he didn't remodel Ebbets Field probably for the same reason that other older stadiums basically could not be remodeled. For starters, the stadium was really in a state of disrepair to the point, I say in the book that Ebbets Field had this raffish charm to it, and people would rhapsodize over it, but usually those were not the people who had to actually see a game in Ebbets Field, which was not always the most pleasant experience. It's the same, it's similar to Fenway Park in the sense that there are some seats in Fenway Park, and of course you're in the Boston area, you know it well, that are fantastic seats. You can't get a better seat for a ball game. But if you're stuck way down the right field line at Fenway Park, as I have been, or even if you're in certain sections of the bleachers, there are a lot of lousy seats in Fenway Park, and there were a lot of lousy seats in Ebbets Field as well. So the stadium would probably have to have been completely demolished or taken out of commission for a number of years to have rehabilitated it to the point where, OMalley would have a certain amount of satisfaction in what the result would be. It also would probably have to have been expanded. He probably would have had to acquire land across the street and in the vicinity of the stadium to rehabilitate it, which would have also created the same problem that he had at Atlantic Flatbush, where he's going to have to somehow buy that land. And, when a landowner sees you coming, meaning he knows you want the land, the price always goes up. Ebbets Field was built in the first place by Charles Ebbets, the old Brooklyn Dodger owner, because he secretly bought up parcels of land that he wanted to build Ebbets Field on, and he bought them up piecemeal from owners who didn't really know what Ebbets was up to and didn't know what their neighbors were doing. So Ebbets was able to get the land that he needed at a reasonable price. But in the Ebbets Field area, just like Atlantic Flatbush, the owners of the land saw OMalley coming, and it was going to cost him a lot of money to do that. And also, OMalley, who had an engineering background, had this image of a perfect stadium in his head. He was very innovative in that way, and his perfect stadium didn't have any poles, no obstructed views, was a baseball-only stadium, was symmetrical, didn't have like that odd Ebbets Field right field fence with the hit sign win suits sign on it, completely symmetrical, and also a stadium that you wouldn't have to climb long distances high up to your seat. In other words, Ebbets was built as all the stadiums were in those days, from the ground up. So if you had a seat in the upper deck, you had to climb. What OMalley wanted for his stadium is you get it in basically the middle of the stadium or at the midpoint of the stadium. So then you have a shorter walk down or a walk up to your seat, and that became the model for most major league stadiums these days, or the modern baseball stadiums. So for all those reasons, rehabilitating Ebbets Field was probably not in the cards. It was probably going to cost him as much assuming he got the land, just assume you get the land at the same price as you would building a new stadium at Atlantic Flatbush. It probably was going to cost him as much or more to rehabilitate Ebbets Field than to build a new stadium. Plus, he wanted a lot more seats than the 32,000 that he had at Ebbets Field, so that's going to cost him more also. I mean, the dome stadium that he had originally proposed, there were various proposals, but one of them was a dome stadium, would have sat 60,000 fans. So for a good number of reasons, rehabilitating Ebbets Field was probably, not really in the cards for him.
And let me ask you this. Standing in his way, Robert Moses. Now, let's get into, because a lot of people don't know how Moses, he built like Reese Park, he built beaches, he built probably, I'd say, 65% of current New York highways, bridges.
Absolutely. He built the Triborough Bridge. He built the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel. If you're in New York and you're riding on a highway, going past a park, going over a bridge, the likelihood is that Robert Moses built it, and it's very hard to compare Robert Moses as a public figure to literally any public figure that we have today. Because if we had a public figure today who had pretty much absolute control over what got built, where it got built, who would build it, and how it was built, you would say, well, a person like that living today in 2017 would be an elected official. Maybe he would be the mayor or something like that. Well, Robert Moses was never elected to any public office ever. And yet in the 1950s, not to mention the 1940s and 1930s, he was the man who decided all the things that I just mentioned. What got built, where it got built, who built it, how it got built. He had pretty much absolute control over that because he was an incredibly skilled bureaucratic infighter. And he had a number of appointed positions. He was the construction czar of New York. He controlled the park system. He had all these he was the president or the head of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Commission. He had a lot of these jobs all at once, and he was known in the 1950s in New York as the power broker. And that's the title of a great, great book that I would definitely recommend, beside my own, of course, to our listeners. Robert Caro's great book, The Power Broker, which is the story of Robert Moses and how he built New York. Moses is incredibly powerful, and if Walter OMalley wants to get the land at Atlantic and Flatbush to build his stadium, Robert Moses has to say yes to that. And the reason specifically Moses has to say yes is because of a law that probably only academic historians remember today or cite today, called the Housing Act of 1949, the Federal Housing Act of 1949. And what that act provided for was that cities could use federal money to condemn blighted or slum properties. They could then sell those properties to private developers or construction companies, and they would build a structure on that property that would fulfill a public purpose. The words public purpose is basically the legal standard. And that could be a school, it could be a park, it could be a hospital. And Robert Moses was the man who controlled that money and controlled that decision. If he wanted you to build something on a slum property, he would have it condemned and sell it off to one of those companies or developers, and they would build it. Now, it gets tricky when you start talking about a privately owned ballpark as a public purpose. That's where it gets you get into an argumentative position there. What Robert Moses said when Walter OMalley asked him, and he asked him a number of times, could you condemn this land at Atlantic and Flatbush for me, and so I can acquire it at a price that I can afford, and then I'll build this private stadium. What Moses said was, first of all, he said, I am not a baseball fan. He doesn't say that right out loud, but Moses hated spectator sports. He thought they were a waste of time. He believed in participatory sports like swimming, but he was, he felt baseball was for rubes, for people who didn't have any initiative. They sat and watched. So Moses, first of all, was not a baseball fan, and second, and perhaps more important, he would tell OMalley that a privately owned stadium is not a public purpose. It does not fulfill a public purpose, and because it doesn't, I am not going to condemn that land and convey it to you at Atlantic and Flatbush. Now, what OMalley argued is that, yes, it does help me personally. It's going to make money for me. A new stadium obviously will, but it also is going to fulfill a public purpose because since I am owning this stadium in Atlantic Flatbush, if it gets built, I'm going to have to pay taxes on it property taxes the way any private owner of any private property would have to do. Now, if the city builds the stadium, it goes off the tax rolls. But since I'm building it, I'm going to have to pay hundreds of thousands and maybe even millions of dollars in property taxes, and that's going to fulfill a public purpose. He also argued that there are going to be jobs that are going to be created, that it's going to help the neighborhood, that it will be an anchor for the Brooklyn neighborhood, and perhaps prevent some of the white flight that was going on in the 1950s as whites flee from Brooklyn to Long Island and the suburbs. And you could argue that a big spiffy stadium in downtown Brooklyn will help prevent that. So OMalley's argument is that it does fulfill a public purpose, even though it's a private stadium. Moses' argument is that it is a privately owned entity and it does not fulfill a public purpose. And such is Moses' power in the 1950s. He is indeed the power broker, that Moses is the one whose opinion carries the day. There's this apocryphal story about Abraham Lincoln's cabinet. They talk about the story. The story involves the Emancipation Proclamation, and supposedly 5 of his cabinet members were against the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course Lincoln is for it. And after the vote comes down, Lincoln says, "Well, the ayes have it," meaning the one aye over the 7 or 5 nays. Well, that's the way Robert Moses operated in the 1950s. You can get all these people who are saying, "Well, this is a public purpose. The stadium should be built," but the only vote that counted, the only single vote that counted, was Robert Moses. He said it wasn't a public purpose, and so it wasn't a public purpose, and OMalley was not going to get that land. And if he didn't get that land, he was not going to be able to build the stadium in Brooklyn that he wanted on his own terms. And on his own terms was privately owned. Moses did offer OMalley a publicly built stadium, a publicly constructed stadium, what became Shea Stadium in Queens, but OMalley didn't want that. He didn't want to be in Queens, and he didn't want to be a renter in a municipal stadium.
Right. I was going to mention Queens because that was his alternatives. But this is what's shocking to me. As a New Yorker, we both understand that New Yorkers have this whole self-centered idea that is the place to be. There is no other place. It's called the city. And a long time ago on Beverly Hills 90210, when I was a teenager, early 20s, they said, Jason Priestley said to his girlfriend, "Why do people in New York City refer to it as the city? Is it the only city in the United States?" Well, Walter OMalley was a New Yorker through and through. The Dodgers had a cult following, unlike any others, even the Red Sox. I think the Red Sox would come close, but the cult following in Brooklyn was this. It didn't matter whether you were black or white or Hispanic or Chinese. When you were at Ebbets Field, no matter the state of you were a Dodger fan. Your colors left you. Now, OMalley is reading the reports of what the Braves did in Milwaukee.
Yeah.
And now he's looking outside of New York. Where did Los Angeles come up during this, scouting by OMalley?
Well, what happens in 1953 really, really shakes OMalley and makes him really redouble his efforts to get a new stadium built in Brooklyn, and that is the move of the sad sack Boston Braves. And I always wonder whether there are still fans in Boston of a certain age who are Boston Brave fans who are now Atlanta Brave fans. There probably are still a few rolling around, but there must be because they were, they had a sad end in Boston, and by 1953 they were a terrible team with terrible attendance. I think their average attendance. It sounds like a misprint, was something like 3,500 a game.
Yep.
They were getting at Braves Field. So they moved to Milwaukee, and everything changes. They get a rapturous welcome in Milwaukee. The city is just obsessed with their Braves, and they get a great, great deal. They get a municipally built stadium. The stadium is already built, and it's sort of expanded County Stadium in Milwaukee to accommodate the new Milwaukee Braves at virtually no rent. It's almost rent-free. In fact, I was amused that when I found that the Milwaukee Braves, their first 2 years in Milwaukee, they decided to pay more than their contractually mandated rent because I think they felt so embarrassed that they were making so much money and paying such little rent that as a gesture of goodwill, they actually paid more than their contractual rent. So they get into the stadium with a great deal, great stadium deal. They have this huge parking lot at County Stadium. Ebbets Field has something like 600 spots or something, or 500 spots. That number may be off a little, but very few spots. And there's something like 9,000 or 10,000 spots in the County Stadium parking lot. So they have this incredible revenue stream. They get a great deal from the county of Milwaukee County on ticket revenue, on concessions revenue, and they're really making a lot of money. And this is really scary to OMalley because, as we baseball fans know, in the 1950s, there's no player draft. It's a complete free agent situation for prospects. If you find the prospect, you sign the prospect. That's how the Yankees did as well as they did for so many years. And what OMalley is worried about is that if he doesn't get a new stadium, the Braves are going to pass the Dodgers in terms of revenue. Now, OMalley is making money in Brooklyn. There's no question about that. He televises his games, or most of his games, on free TV, and he gets television money from that. But he is worried that if the Braves keep making money, they're going to be able to outbid the Dodgers for prospects. They're going to be able to sign better scouts, better people in the organization up and down, and they're going to pass the Dodgers because they have these revenue streams. Oh, and County Stadium has about 11 or 12,000 more seats than Ebbets Field. I think it seats 43,000. So they have that built-in advantage on ticket revenue there as well. So OMalley figures that it's not going to happen today or tomorrow, but eventually, and this is a man who always is looking ahead, eventually the Braves are going to make a lot more money than us, and they're going to pass us on the field. And what he sees in the 50s, after the Braves moved to Milwaukee, almost confirms his fears because they're like a last-place or seventh-place team when they moved to Milwaukee, and every year after that, 54, 55, 56, 57, they get better and better and better. And finally, in 1957, they win the World Series. As we know, they win the pennant and they beat the Yankees in 7 games. So OMalley feels even more strongly that he needs a new stadium because he needs the new revenue streams that a big new stadium will provide him, so he can compete with the Milwaukee Braves. Now, as we know, of course, there's a certain irony to this story because the Milwaukee Braves haven't played in Milwaukee in, I guess, over 50 years now, and eventually they had to leave. So it's hard for us to believe that Walter OMalley would be more afraid of the Milwaukee Braves than he was even the Yankees or the Giants, but apparently he was because that was really what was going through his mind starting in 1953. Not so much I got to beat the Yankees. Of course, he wanted to beat the Yankees in the World Series. Not so much I want to beat the Giants, and obviously the Giants are a built-in competitor, but I have to beat the Braves. And if I don't beat the Braves, I'm going to be in a worse and worse situation. And, the argument is, well, he had that TV money in New York, which he did. But what he also worries about is if the Dodgers start to do worse on the field, my TV contract is going to be worth less and less because, it's WOR, Channel 9 in New York. They're not going to be willing to pay the kinds of rights fees, and I won't get the advertising money that I would have gotten with a really good team. So it actually matters whether the Dodgers finish first or third or fourth or even second, because it's going to affect the amount of money on the contract, the TV contract, and it's going to affect my advertising rates. So I need to put a good product on the field. I need to put a pennant winner on the field. Even though I'm making money now on the TV, it's going to hurt me. It's going to hurt me down the road. So that's what he was worried about as well.
But the thing that drives me is you're talking about a city OMalley doesn't know. He doesn't know anything about Los Angeles. Again, the farthest city west was St. Louis. So maybe somewhere in the middle of the country would make sense. Why Los Angeles?
Well, Los Angeles, then as an owner and as a businessman, he has to think of markets. And Los Angeles is this immense market. It is the fourth biggest city in the country, moving up in the 1950s. I think with the 1960 census, it's going to be third. I think it was fourth during the 1950s. And it doesn't have a Major League Baseball team. I mean, it's just this yawning market, this yawning, growing market that someone is going to eventually go into, whether it's an expansion team or the move of a franchise. And OMalley decides that if it's going to be anyone, it's going to be him. But again, here it gets complicated because historians are always trying to look into their subjects' heads. They're always trying to figure out what's going on in the minds of their historical subjects. And it's hard, obviously, for anyone to figure out, as a historian, what anyone is thinking. But for my money, and I did spend a lot of time looking at archives and thinking about this and talking to people and reading newspaper clippings, OMalley really did want to stay in New York, and he wanted to stay in New York for the reason that you mentioned earlier, Ian. He's a New Yorker. He has spent, if you think about it, he went to the University of Pennsylvania for college, so that's 4 years. And he went to a military school in Indiana, I think, for 2 or 3 years when he was a teenager. That's maybe a total of 6 or 7 years in his entire life that he has not lived in New York or the New York City area. By the 1950s, he's living in Amityville out on Long Island. He was living in Brooklyn before that. So he is a New Yorker through and through. And as you mentioned earlier, New Yorkers think that their city is the only city in the world. As a New Yorker myself, I always have to chuckle when there was a book a number of years ago called Tales of the City about San Francisco. And in San Francisco, they have a tendency to call their city the city. And I always chuckle about that because I always say to my San Francisco friends, there's only one city, and that's New York. Well, Walter OMalley felt that way himself. So he didn't want to leave New York. But if he was going to leave New York, he had his eye on Los Angeles because it was such an untapped market. Now, the problem with the idea that he had decided very early on he was going to move to L.A., in the early 50s or even the late 40s, he was going to move to L.A., is that he was remarkably unfamiliar with Los Angeles, and that really struck me when I started to do the research for the book. That you would think that he would know all about Los Angeles, but when he made the decision to move to Los Angeles in October '57, he had only visited Los Angeles 3 times in his entire life. All 3 times it was within the previous year or so, and I tried to figure out how many days total he had spent in Los Angeles. It was 10 days or less. He was remarkably unfamiliar with the city. He didn't understand its politics. He didn't understand who the power brokers were, if there were any, in that city. He didn't know about the political mechanisms of the city and the state, including the referendum, which he was completely unfamiliar with. He didn't know he was going to get sued the minute he walked off the plane, which is what happened. He got served with process as he literally walked onto the airport tarmac when he arrived in L.A. So he didn't know all these things about L.A., and my feeling about him is that he is a very careful, very meticulous businessman. He always plans ahead. In terms of planning Dodger Stadium, he planned it very meticulously. He really got down into the right on the ground level about what are the seats going to look like, what are the bathrooms going to look like. So he's a planner, and it seemed to me that if he had decided that he was going to move to L.A. all along, that he would have done a lot more research on the city. Now, the question of whether there are cities between St. Louis, which is the westernmost outpost of Major League Baseball, and until 1957, or Kansas City. And L.A., well, he always said, OMalley said, I want to build my stadium in Brooklyn, and if I can't be in Brooklyn, it doesn't matter whether I'm 10 miles away or 3,000 miles away. I'm not going to be in Brooklyn. That was his answer to Robert Moses when Moses said, well, why not build a stadium in Queens? We'll build it Flushing Meadow in Queens, what became Shea Stadium. OMalley says, I'm going to be either 10 miles, if I'm 10 miles away or 3,000 miles away from Brooklyn, which is where I want to be. It doesn't matter to me. And I think he used that logic when he said, well, if I'm going to leave, if I have to leave New York, it might as well be Los Angeles because it's the biggest market and because there really isn't another city between St. Louis or Kansas City and Los Angeles that has that kind of power. I mean, Denver perhaps, and of course Denver ends up getting a major league team eventually, but there's really no other place than Los Angeles. And so he makes the decision to leave New York, I think, quite reluctantly and really quite late in the game. September, October 1957, he finally makes the final decision. But once he decides to leave, he knows he has to go to Los Angeles because if he doesn't, somebody else will.
And you know it's odd also because California had their own baseball league, the Pacific Coast.
Yes, they did, the PCL, the Pacific Coast League, yeah.
And, both Stoneham and OMalley saw this. And you know something? Not a lot of love or, there's been a few books written on the subject, but that Pacific Coast League, they got a lot of people out of it. I mean, Casey Stengel, he coached Oakland Oaks to a championship. Billy Martin came, DiMaggio. They had key players, but now you're infringing upon that. You're moving your teams out there, and they never had a market for Major League Baseball. Now with OMalley, when he finally made up the decision to go, Stoneham announced it, I think, in August, and by the end of September,
August he announces his leave.
Yeah, in August, people were ripping up the Polo Grounds on their last game, whereas OMalley.
That last game, I've seen pictures of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so, they were all ready to move the Giants. They were supposed to go to Minneapolis, but they backed out of the deal because Major League Baseball said, listen, both of you have to go out there. If one of you back out of the deal, this is it. Why did OMalley agree to that?
Well, because in 1957, and I think this is what confuses a lot of people who say, well, he never had any interest in staying in New York. He was negotiating with L.A. and New York at the same time, and when Stoneham supposedly before the '57 season says, "This is my last year, Walter, in the Polo Grounds. I'm going to move to Minneapolis," and supposedly OMalley says, "Well, if you're going to leave, you should think about the West Coast because then if we have to leave, we can leave together." A lot of that is very murky. Nothing is written down, so it's all hearsay. So, there are people who say, well, OMalley told Stoneham to move to San Francisco. I don't think that's the case. I think he suggested as a businessman that they would probably be better off if they were going to moving together, and that moving to Minneapolis was not going to preserve their rivalry, basically. So you have that. But in terms of the PCL or the Pacific Coast League, the Pacific Coast League comes very close to getting a major league status for itself in the 40s and 50s. That's what they're asking for. The quality of play in the Pacific Coast League is just a notch under what it is in Major League Baseball in the 1940s and 1950s. So, history could have gone in a completely different direction if Major League Baseball was really innovative in the early 1950s and said, we're going to start a new third major league composed of Pacific Coast League clubs, because had they done that, Walter OMalley would have been probably forced to stay in New York no matter what. But what OMalley is doing in 1957 is he is negotiating simultaneously with New York and with Los Angeles. And he is basically saying to himself, I'm going to go with the city that gives me the better deal. But the deal I really want is the deal in New York. And all things being equal, I would rather stay in New York. And he actually says that over the phone to one of the Los Angeles City Council women, Rosalind Wyman, literally the day that the decision is made, October 7th, 1957. The LA City Council is meeting to decide whether they're going to formally approve a contract offer to the Dodgers to build Dodger Stadium. And it's having trouble getting through the LA City Council. There's a lot of opposition to it. So this councilman, Rosalind Wyman, calls up Walter OMalley or talks to him over the phone and says, if we approve this deal, will you come to Los Angeles? And what he says to her is, and she's still alive, and she's recounted this conversation. I really am a New Yorker. If I had my choice, I would stay in New York. And he sounded very reluctant, even up to the day that the LA City Council made the decision to offer him this contract. Now, what happens is she hangs up the phone. They have the vote in the LA City Council. It passes by one vote, and they make the offer. And the next day, he makes the announcement. OMalley makes the announcement that they're moving to LA. But what he does in New York in '57 is he is negotiating with both sides at the same time, and I think that's what confuses people when they say, "Oh, he never was serious about New York. He always wanted to move to LA." That's not the case. If New York had given him the deal he wanted, and as late as September of 1957, there was a chance that he could get that deal in New York. As long as he could get the deal in New York, that's where he was going to stay because he was a New Yorker. And as we know, New Yorkers think New York is the center of the universe, and certainly OMalley did.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and there's no question about that. What I'd like to do is this, Jerald, because I want to stop here because the inquiry, we have to go into Proposition B. We have to go into this whole political stuff. And I'm going to have a part 2 and 3, I think, on this because it's just too lengthy to just call it for 1 hour. And I think this is very important. I'm very, very happy with the way our conversation went because you gave more facts and insight, than you can when you probably edited your book. And it's very important that people know piece by piece the troubles that OMalley had. We see what happened in New York. We see what happened in Queens. He didn't want it. And we see what's going on and why he's looking west. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you back on the show if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that'll be great. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. We'll have a part 2, which will it'll be another hour. We'll talk about the politics, and then we'll probably have a part 3, the building of Dodger Stadium, which is big in itself.
In and of itself. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, we'll do that. I just want to let the listeners know that this has been a great time. I had a great time with you. I mean, this is fantastic stuff.
Oh, thank you.
This is fantastic stuff. Hold the line, because this is how I end the show, and after I end it, I'll say a few words. Folks, you got to go out and get this book. We've just spoken nearly an hour, and there's just so much to talk about. The City of Dreams of Dodger Stadium. Go out, go learn about what really happened. We're going to be back with Jerald probably in September. I'll give him an email. I'll give him a shout-out when the kids go back to school, and we'll have him on for a part 2. And I thank you, Jerald, for being on the show. Again, hold the line. Folks, as always, I am Ian Kahanowitz, and you have been listening to Genesis. And thank you to our guest, Jerald Podair. And, of course, as I end it, in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks, and good luck. We'll see you next time.